Good day. This second module digs further into why and how the electricity system is changing so radically. So let's start with a little tutorial on how system operators dispatch, that is, call for output from different resources at different times to keep supply and demand always in instantaneous balance so that the frequency of the alternating current grid stays within its narrow stability limits and won't damage equipment. The biggest U.S. power pool, called PJM, covering many eastern states into the Midwest, offers a simple example of how a grid operator thinks about which resources to use at each moment. Traditionally, resources meant power stations because Negawatts, Flexiwatts, and distributed renewables weren't yet allowed to compete. Now, here you can see nothing yet from the demand side, but a little renewable power is creeping in on the far left of this merit order stack. And the renewables run whenever they're available because they cost less to run than the nuclear, hydro, gas, coal storage, or oil-fired peaking plants. Those are the red bar at the far right. And the oil plants are so costly to run, they would get turned on only as a last resort to keep the grid from collapsing. As demand rises, as you go towards the right, the operator adds or dispatches more and more plants at successively higher operating costs. And modern grids normally automate this process as an auction where plant operators compete every hour or half hour or quarter hour to dispatch their power and earn revenue, often at the clearing price. But except in the anomalous price spikes of 2022 and 3, the black coal and purple gas generators and even nuclear plants, if not propped up by new subsidies, are being pushed off the right-hand end of the chart. That is, they're running for so few hours that they can't earn enough to cover their costs, and so they're forced to retire. And the piston doing that pushing is, of course, from the left side, it's the nearly free-to-run renewables entering at the far left, and where they're allowed to compete cheap demand-side resources too. 3 slides from the Regulatory Assistance Project illustrate the challenge facing fossil fuel power plants. Traditional electricity demand patterns throughout a year, varying with seasons and weekends, so little teeth on it, they seem to show a substantial minimum load across the bottom that's always there. So traditionally, it seems sensible to run giant plants steadily at minimum cost. However, if only a modest part, in this case 27%, of annual electricity comes from sun and wind, then the remaining demand, called net demand, often dissects this supposedly steady load. It cuts notches in it. And serving that varying net load by running fueled plants would raise costs. So now we need a more flexible resource mix chosen for that value and operated for reliability at least cost every hour of the year. Now, there may still be an occasional need for peaking plants that rarely run to meet extreme loads. Renewables run routinely whenever they can, because they cost almost nothing to run, but the traditional big thermal plants are no longer a good match for what's in between. They're meant for continuous operations, so they're ponderous and inflexible. So they're slow and hard to cycle up and down. Cycling also reduces their life and their efficiency and raises maintenance costs. And of course, cycling a plant with especially high capital costs like nuclear spreads its fixed costs over fewer kilowatt hours generated, and that makes its economics even worse. By the way, proponents of so-called small modular reactors, up to 300 megawatts electric, which is hardly small, say that those will be both cheap and flexible. But if they were cheap in steady operation, a fantasy as we'll see, then ramping them up and down to complement variable renewables, claimed to be a great virtue they have, would make them no longer cheap. You can't have high and low capacity factor at the same time. Now, we often hear a term called baseload. It's an antique honorific traditionally applied to big thermal power plants, and it has at least 5 meanings. The first of them refers to apparently steady gross loads. Then the meanings that are standard in the utility industry, numbers 2 and 3, are based on economics. And meanings number 4 and 5 are based on size or on technology. So the utility meanings refer to whichever plants can run cheapest if you're operating them, or produce cheapest overall if you're planning them. But some people think baseload just means a big thermal plant, maybe a big hydro dam sometimes, or just some hypothetical power plant that runs all the time, every moment of the year. There is no such thing. Now, some people have even proposed adding other definitions, but it's way too late. Many experts now consider the term baseload to be obsolete or useless or worse. It's overdue to be gracefully retired. And the reason is the modern grids are base costs, with renewables cheapest to dispatch, and then everything else follows the net load that's left over. US wholesale power markets are briskly retiring unneeded, uneconomic, and inflexible thermal power plants as cheaper and more agile resources come in to take their place. Retiring the people who steadily think in flexible thoughts does take longer. There's a current fashion of substituting the word firm for baseload. That doesn't make the concept less obsolete. The senior DOE official who recently said that every comprehensive plan to decarbonize the US grid by 2035 features what he called clean firm power, notably nuclear, was simply incorrect. Big power plants also merit 3 other observations. First one is that advocates often claim that big thermal power plants are reliable, but small units are not reliable. Well, one plant is arithmetically equivalent to many small plants, but electricity is not arithmetic. Portfolios of many small units add reliability just the same way that diversified stock portfolios reduce risk, and with the same mathematics. Nearer to the load is also better because big plants depend absolutely on those big transmission lines. And you remember 98 or 99% of US power failures start in the grid. Big thermal plants also need abundant and not too hot cooling water. So they're vulnerable not just to accidental or deliberate transmission faults and to wide area transmission failures from solar storms or electromagnetic pulse. They're also vulnerable to ever more frequent droughts and heat waves. Nuclear plants are especially vulnerable both to climate change and to a little noticed quirk of nuclear physics. Reactors must immediately shut down if the grid power fails, and then they depend entirely on their on-site diesel generators, which are not entirely reliable, to remove the initially intense decay heat lest they melt down, as 4 did at Fukushima Daiichi. But abrupt shutdown, which is called SCRAM, leaves the power reactors unable to restart properly and run stably because certain fission products, chiefly isotopes of xenon and samarium, are like sponges. They soak up too many neutrons. And that's why after the 2003 Northeast blackout, it took 12 days to restore the 9 affected US reactors to full power, and they had almost no output for the first few days. Canada had to beg Ontarians not to turn stuff on because their CANDU heavy water reactors have an even more delicate neutron economy, and that they had even more trouble restarting. So this is a kind of anti-peaker property of being guaranteed unavailable when most needed. It has no parallel among other energy sources, least of all renewables. Another illustration of unreliability of big thermal plants comes lately from France, where the average nuclear plant in 2020 produced zero power a third of the time, usually unpredictably, and planned outages lasted an average of 44% longer than planned. Flexiwatts 2 recently restarted after 40 successive revisions of the date and time that it would restart. So as Michael Schneider says, the nuclear fleet is the most intermittent power resource in France. In December 2021, France had more nuclear capacity closed for repairs and safety checks than Germany had cumulatively closed ever. And in 2022, over half of France's nuclear capacity was closed for 62% of the hours. So that turned France from a 4-decade net power exporter to a net importer of electricity. If France's 2019 to 22 nuclear shortfall were offset by combined cycle gas generation, as it may well have been, it would have used far more gas than Europe's spring 2022 gas storage shortfall that was threatening Europe's energy security. And it gave Mr. Putin a lot more geopolitical leverage. It caused skyrocketing prices. And for all of 2022, the French nuclear shortfall was a bigger cause of European electricity scarcity than Putin's war was. Now, second point, a lot of analysts use outdated data and assumptions about how much electricity a unit of generated capacity actually produces from different sources. Many, by the way, also miscalculate by comparing year-end installed capacity with whole year output. That badly understates the output of fast-growing renewables like wind and solar, which may compress installations into late in each year to meet tax law deadlines in particular. But if you have rapid growth, then a lot of capacity is getting added during the year that doesn't have time to generate for the whole year. So you're understating capacity factor. The correct method is to add and then capacity weight the output that's measured project by project, starting whenever each project entered service. U.S. Energy Information Administration made this mistake too through a programming error. I caught it, they fixed it. We now have accurate data for utility scale projects since 2010, although not yet for smaller projects that are a third of the new solar capacity additions and produce upwards of 40 terawatt hours a year in the US alone. So here are the latest annual data. Well-running nuclear plants, since most of the lemons have retired, averaged an exemplary 93% in 2021. Their downtime was mainly for refueling about every year and a half. Geothermal and biomass plants averaged about 60 or 70% capacity factor. Remember, capacity factor is the fraction of rated output full time that they actually produce over the year. And geothermal and biomass are generally dispatchable, that is, you can turn them up and down as desired, although, say, varying cogeneration in a pulp mill is constrained by demands for process heat. Gas combined cycle plants came in after the various kinds of biomass. They came next at 55%. That doesn't count gas turbine peakers, the so-called simple cycle generators, which are so inefficient and therefore costly that they're seldom run. Coal came next at 49%, temporarily up 2 percentage points as gas prices spiked. Hydropower averaged 36%, and it fluctuates several percentage points year on year with precipitation. It was 41% in 2020, for example. Wind averaged 34% and rising. Offshore wind's often around 50+%, sometimes 60+. It's just starting to enter the US market. Photovoltaics averaged 24% and rising. And solar thermal, you'd think, would be higher than that because it has thermal storage, which would run after the sun sets, but it isn't yet higher due to teething troubles. Now, as the coal and gas capacity factors fall with dispatch competition, as they get pushed out by renewables, they should come down and cross the rising capacity factors of solar and wind in the coming years. Many individual fossil fuel plants are already suffering this fate and exiting the market because they cost too much to run. And at least half the nuclear plants also cost more to run than they earn in an ordinary year. So they too are worth closing, as we'll discuss next week. Third point, in a world of what Jerome called hell and high water, the climate change already committed by greenhouse gases, already released, is twice as big as we've seen yet. So fasten your seatbelts and check your life jackets. We are already seeing flooding in major storm events, as illustrated here in New York City and in Nebraska in the center image. Coastal flooding will get dramatically worse with sea level rise, plus more and stronger and wetter hurricanes. By the way, that's very bad news for a great many nuclear plants that are on the coasts. On the right, you can see a solar project in the Virgin Islands hit by a hurricane, but damage like that's generally easier to repair quickly, and it's even easier to avoid. RMI has a report called Solar Under Storm on how to design photovoltaic projects that resist Cat 5 hurricanes, and it was instantly snapped up and adopted by insurers of energy industry assets. Addressing those insurers, Trade Group PowerCon in 2019, which is the first time any of them had learned about the disruptive energy futures ahead, taught me that those insurers can be a major ally and leverage point in changing energy industry strategies and behaviors. So whenever you run into a risk, think about who insures it and could they be an ally. So subject to the usual cautions, what is the general pattern of levelized cost of energy, LCOE, from modern renewables? Well, here's the authoritative summary that everybody shows from Bloomberg New Energy Finance's global database of over 24,000 actual projects tracked by hundreds of people around the world. Notice the dramatic declines over, 11 years, more than that. The even sharper decline of battery costs in red. In 2021 and 2, though, supply chain issues did cause modest upticks in some costs, but that is not expected to last. And renewables, importantly, continue to be coal and gas projects. For example, the global benchmark for gas power, $93 a megawatt hour, is over twice the cost of solar or onshore wind. And as hoped, offshore wind's rapidly dropping cost now beats coal and gas power for the first time. So despite headwinds in materials and debt costs and a strong US dollar, renewables do continue to win in fair price competition. Until 2021, the lithium-ion battery costs fell even faster than solar costs. You see the little uptick at the far right. Interestingly, the learning curve, the decline in real cost for each doubling of cumulative production is actually steeper for PVs than for batteries. Each learning curve depends on carefully analyzed technical and operating trends that add up to the lower row of improvements, but the result depends on the period in which you measure it. So the current uptick in battery prices, the 7% rise in 2022 for the first time in at least 12 years and likely to persist through 2023, that's not expected to inhibit a near doubling of US battery installations on the US grid in 2023. Bloomberg recently asked 180 developers of storage projects whether they're going to cancel if prices stay high. The number saying yes was 0. Only 10% said they would even postpone their projects. It's such a hot market. Notice that the upper row of graphs here shows equipment prices, not whole project prices, not energy prices. It's specific to the kind of equipment shown. And those equipment prices also depend strongly on the cost of capital when you get them into an actual project. You need to finance them. And renewables have almost pure capital costs and almost zero operating costs. Capital, though, became markedly cheaper, especially for renewable projects under long-term contracts, as most big ones are, because of their solid annuity-like financial structure and their low financial risk. So the Financial Times a few years ago compared the roughly 3 to 5% cost of capital for European and US renewables with the much higher cost of capital for oil and gas exploration, often around 15 or 20%. That's called a risk premium. However, most comparisons of renewable with fossil or nuclear generators arbitrarily assume that they all pay the same for capital, as if the observed capital market risk premium for non-renewables didn't actually exist. And that analytic error, surely they know better. It's a huge hidden distortion in favor of incumbents. And you'd be surprised at what distinguished outfits make this mistake. But some are not doing that. Actually, the IEA now has a cost of capital observatory, which has a wonderful collection of data on what you pay for capital for which kind of project in which country in what year and so on. Now, here's a disturbing graph showing that since the 1980s, equity returns to investors in US regulated utilities have been diverging from corporate bond yields in red and from treasury debt in blue. Utilities were traditionally considered less risky than typical corporations. And those corporations' risk, you can see in the difference between green and blue, earned returns just 1 to a few percentage points above treasuries, which were considered financially riskless, at least until the current Congress. But the black dots, each of which comes from an electric or gas rate case, show a gigantic spread to utility equity as if it were among the riskiest investments in the whole economy. In the long run, I suppose that might actually be true for utilities so misaligned with the energy transition that the 8 Pac-Men devour them, but surely this is unhinged from short-term market realities. Such a fat spread, looks like, what, 6+ percentage points, can only reflect some combination of undue influence, distorted politics, or staffing and informational asymmetries. If you have other hypotheses, love to hear them. But if you multiply these high returns times over investments that inflate rate base, you get a huge wealth transfer away from the most dynamic developers and the best buys and toward stodgy incumbents. Performance-based rate making was supposed to fix all this, but it mainly ended up adding a premium to already excessive returns on cost of service regulation. So, utilities that earn less under performance-based systems, such as some states have, New York, Hawaii, could actually sue their regulators and they may well win. So there's a real problem here in cost of capital. As far as I know, all serious analyses of electricity and technology costs agree that renewables are winning by large and increasing margins. Here's one illustration from a November 22 US assessment by NextEra Energy. That's the biggest US renewable investor. They happen to own Florida Power and Light, which for its own reasons makes it hard for residents of the Sunshine State to install rooftop solar power, but NextEra cheerfully invests billions in renewables in its competitors' territories. Well, you can see why. NextEra agrees that adding 4 hours of storage, the little shaded areas, to solar or wind power is far from disturbing its huge cost advantage over even existing, let alone new thermal power stations. This is quite similar to the numbers you'll find from Bloomberg, Lazard, and so on. From its rich bottom-up data set, Bloomberg New Energy Finance has concluded that in countries with over 2/3 of the world's people and 90% of its power generation, unsubsidized renewables in 2020 became the cheapest source of new bulk electricity. And in countries with nearly half the world's people and 43% of electricity generation, notably including China and India, new solar or wind beats just the operating costs of existing coal and gas plants. Bloomberg New Energy Finance also found that the cheapest way to meet a flat load is now, as I mentioned earlier, variable renewables plus backup, storage, renewable or fueled. It is not traditional thermal power plants that we were told we needed to meet a flat load with so-called baseload supply. Well, these findings are strengthening year by year, and that's because renewables and batteries generally keep trending cheaper, with a little uptick at the moment, while coal and gas and nuclear plants exhibit negligible or no learning curves. COVID rebound, although not to pre-pandemic levels, and severe hydro droughts and Putin's war caused some countries, chiefly India, China, US, over half China, to burn more coal in power plants during 2021 and 2. And that spike is expected to reverse in 2023 when signals so far point to record renewable growth, driven by cost and climate and security imperatives. Most world markets are just abandoning fossil power growth and shifting rapidly to renewables. That is, their investments follow economic logic. In the United States, the wholesale electricity prices that old coal and nuclear plants increasingly fail to beat in regional auctions have been closely correlated with natural gas prices because combined cycle gas plants have often been the marginal resource, the last thing that's turning on. Many grid forecasting models still assume that all generators do or should act like gas plants, but that is decreasingly true. Based on gas-centric modeling, which still predominates, uncertainties about future gas price made forecast renewable growth highly uncertain if it weren't driven or stabilized by policy. Here are some standard forecasts shown by the National Renewable Energy Lab in 2018. You notice by 2050, there's a 7-fold range in the market capture by variable renewable sources. 7-fold range makes this pretty useless. So to peer into the future, we need not a roulette wheel, but some insight into the fundamentals, what's really going on here. And there's a lovely new NREL engine. You can see some output from it here that now makes it easy to track how the renewable forecasts by 4 leading organizations have evolved from year to year for each resource. If you glance at the left graph, you'll see that Bloomberg New Energy Finance is more market attuned, is getting the slope right, for example. EIA and formerly IEA look more econometric, turn the crank on the model that summarizes what used to be happening. So although there's still a 2-fold spread in the long-term results on the right, that's better than 7-fold, and it's becoming easier to see where these differences actually come from and what kinds of model structure and, if you like, mental map they reflect. Well, let's go to some real data. This graph combines the market prices of actual US projects where diameter indicates capacity for photovoltaics in orange and wind in blue. Both of those now usually beat the heavy dashed line, which is the gas cost alone for existing combined cycle plants. That's most of the gas capacity that makes almost 2/5 of US electricity. And therefore, gas plants will run fewer hours until they go broke, as some already have, even in Texas. But meanwhile, digitization, renewables, new business models are going to move the power system's asset utilization the other way from 50% to 80 or 90% and drive marginal power costs nearly to zero. Bloomberg reckons that new unsubsidized PV and wind already beat most US coal operating costs, 99% of it actually, and they'll beat gas operating costs by 2035. So renewable growth no longer depends significantly on the uncertain gas price. That dramatically unclouds the crystal ball. Both new and existing gas power are in deep trouble against today's unsubsidized renewables, let alone actually subsidized ones. And this comparison does not even count 3 big externalities of gas power: CO2 emissions, methane emissions from the whole upstream system. And a third biggie that is often overlooked. So here's the issue. Financial economics requires that when you're comparing a volatile gas stream like gas with a constant price cost stream like efficiency or renewables, we must risk adjust by including the market value of the price volatility. Otherwise, it would be like deciding whether to get a fixed or variable rate mortgage based on only the interest rate without counting that the variable rate one can change. It's volatile. Well, including the market value of gas price volatility can increase the effective gas price by about $1 or $2 per 1,000 cubic feet or per gigajoule. If fracking makes wellhead gas cheap and abundant, that could further increase retail price volatility. And even if you ignore gas price volatility, it does impose risk and it deters finance. The risk doesn't go away. You just shuffle it around. Somebody's bearing the risk. So what is that risk? Well, here's the green record of U.S. real natural gas prices using the benchmark called Henry Hub, which is a wholesale trading point, dominates the market. And that history warns us not to invest based on spot price and not to invest based on official price forecasts in blue, which, as you can see, are simplistically modeled to trend upwards at various rates from the most recent price. You've seen this before in the hedgehog graph, and it's absolutely the wrong way to think about it. Volatility is much higher lately than shown here in Asia and Europe. In fact, gas prices spiked by 15-fold in 17 months, underscoring the role of geopolitics. And for both geopolitical and environmental reasons, the new German government wants to phase out coal by 2030 and a world first to phase out gas by 2045. And the fuel disruptions from Putin's war causing huge price swings underscore the wisdom of that choice. So there is a new story, or there was until the frackers went broke, and now they're temporarily flush again, but not for long. And the story is about abundant and affordable energy for the long haul, but it's less about frack gas than about its inexhaustible, benign, carbon-free, stably priced physical hedges, namely efficiency and renewables, that are outpacing and increasingly outcompeting fracked gas. And if you combine the competitive threats to gases markets on the demand and supply sides of power, process heat, building heat and appliances, even petrochemicals at risk from plastics backlash, smart material cycles by feedstocks, you'll see that no gas market is safe. And I would now expect world gas demand may fall roughly in phase with oil demand, not decades later, even if the industry resolves the mortal threat of methane emissions. Another potent competitor is photovoltaics plus on-site battery backup. That combination is called hybrid generation, although the levelized prices shown in this graph do include the current temporary federal tax credits. Now, many of these hybrid projects beat just the fuel cost of combined cycle gas plants. So it's not surprising that most new California utility scale solar power now comes with batteries. At the end of 2021, there were 676 gigawatts, huge number, of utility scale solar power queued for US interconnection, of which 42% included batteries. And those queued up solar projects and their hybrid storage exceeded the total queued capacity of wind and standalone storage and natural gas-fired capacity. In China, 19 provinces as of August 21 require renewables to be paired with storage. That accelerates the displacement of coal power. Just in 2020, the world added about as much capacity in utility scale lithium-ion batteries as it added in nuclear power, not counting its nearly as big retirements. In spring 2022, lithium-ion batteries, long assumed to cost too much beyond about 4 hours of storage, defeated all competitors in a project with 8 hours storage. So adding more batteries so far just tends to beat fancier or newer technologies, although there's plenty of horses in this race. Oh, and in case you're wondering, U.S. Department of Energy is very mindful that historically only 23% of the projects queued for transmission access actually got built. So they're trying to speed approvals and reduce withdrawals from the queue. Actually, the end of 21, there were 1,100 gigawatts of queued wind and solar capacity that we would need to approach zero carbon US electricity. It was about the right amount. And over 84% of that was already awaiting grid approval, along with 420 gigawatts of storage. So to be clear, we would need 1,100 gigawatts to get to zero carbon electricity of wind and solar, and over 84% was already in the queue, and a lot of storage. Well, gas then is no longer the real competitor to beat. The real competitor to beat is modern renewables, and of course, efficiency and demand response. So on the modern renewables, here are Berkeley Labs' authoritative actual project by project solar and wind power long-term contract prices, power purchase agreement or PPA prices that the off-taker agrees to pay the developer for that electricity. And each PV or wind power project is a circle. Its diameter is proportional to its capacity. Really rich data here from Berkeley Lab. They're wonderful at this stuff. And you can see how much variation there is between projects and between regions, different power pools, color-coded. But the general trends are encouraging. And nowadays, solar often even beats wind power. Although some recent wind contracts levelize prices after tax credit range from the mid-teens to as low as $8.6 a megawatt hour. That's 0.86 cents a kilowatt hour. Darn near free. By the way, Berkeley Lab also analyzes photovoltaics projects up to 5 AC megawatts. And those projects installed prices in the commercial sector, even in 2019, averaged twice the price of utility scale projects, or 3 times for residential, both excluding batteries. But as noted earlier, they deliver cheaper power than average US grid power starting in 2020, because grid costs and delivery costs dominate over generating costs. Now, another thing to bear in mind, those renewable prices are levelized. It's a way of evening out escalation or other changes over the life of the contract. But of course, a flat nominal price, the way 2/3 of US solar power is actually sold, means a declining real or inflation adjusted price as shown on the green line. And meanwhile, natural gas prices to combined cycle turbines are officially forecast to rise or at least stay flat, the blue curve. And that makes future US renewables even more competitive. These graphs all precede the current gas price run-up triggered by Putin's war. US renewable federal tax credits are historically disruptive because they became a bargaining chip in unrelated political disputes. It's been going on for a long time. This NREL graph shows 5 expirations and numerous short-term extensions that deterred investment, slowed deployment, and raised costs well above those seen abroad under more stable policies. Partly why US solar is so much more expensive than some other countries, even though we all buy the same stuff from China and elsewhere to make it. This pattern has actually continued ever since, although it's becoming less disruptive as subsidies generally decline and unsubsidized renewable prices fall. Currently, renewable growth is really quite robust due to Inflation Reduction Act subsidies that are not shown here in the boxes in the lower right in and after 2023, where it says $0 a megawatt hour. That's no longer the case. Now, the father of those tax credits and their extensions for many, many years was Senate Finance Committee Chair Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa. His state is, well, as of 2022, 57% wind powered, highest in the country. And he's well aware that something like 86% of US wind farms are in Republican congressional districts. So is most solar power. The senator memorably remarked that politicians who say they favor all of the above energy policies often turn out on closer examination to favor none of the above and all of the below. Good line. Turning now to the electricity demand side, beyond merely efficient use, timely use, flexible loads or Flexiwatts can take many different forms. Demand response is rapidly becoming available and attractive even to small and unsophisticated customers, often in ways that the customer finds beneficial or even invisible. Demand response is a powerful resource to which many utilities have not yet fully adapted. Here's an example from Hawaii, where a typical household uses appliances at various times of the 24-hour day, roughly half while rooftop PVs are operating. That's the yellow curve. But their main utility, having tried and failed in the old days to prohibit solar hookups, then wanted to confiscate any leftover solar production without paying for it. And actually, they still sort of do so at the annual true-up, which is akin to frequent flyer miles that expire. Well, how might you expect angry customers to respond to this? Well, probably they'd ask the same vendors who provide their photovoltaics and batteries to offer them smart appliances to move 80 or 90% of household loads conveniently into those solar hours. And that would cost the utility nearly all its intended windfall and most of its ordinary revenue. So that anti-solar tariff, like all 6 RMI studied, turns out to be a well-aimed boomerang that will actually speed and expand solar adoption by educating and annoying the customers so they leave the grid faster. Happily, RMI was able to help the Hawaiian parties agree on far more sensible strategies, but it is now economic there for new houses not to connect to the grid. At average efficiencies and with the solar water heating that state code requires, a PV and battery system plus a small fuel generator that might run very briefly a few times a year costs you about $30,000 without or $20,000 with state and federal credits. Well, all that rolls into the mortgage for about $100 a month, but each month it avoids an $11 fixed utility charge plus an average bill of $161. The surplus over $700 a year more than pays for maintenance, for a new inverter after 15 years, for a few gallons of generator fuel. So not connecting to the grid saves money. We're going to see more of that. Now, speaking of islands, they all pay a lot for motor fuel and their short driving ranges fit cheap EVs. So now the special role of electric utilities in grid stabilization and greater renewable share is being proven also in Portugal on what is billed as the world's first emission-free island, although there are others. The cheaper batteries get, the bigger they're going to get in the bigger fleet of electric autos, increasing that demand response resource. So the world's passenger EV sales, over 10 million units a year, imply at least half a terawatt of peak storage capacity that's parked most of the time. So bidirectional charging, which an increasing number of models offer, in even a small fraction of those cars could be a huge new load balancing resource. And the first lab for that could come in Hawaii. And that's because HECO's customers have distributed PV generation there already equivalent to 72% of peak load. And the utility expects up to 200 megawatts of EV load by 2030 on a 1,000 megawatt system, fifth of their whole load. All but one of the islands are small enough that even the modest battery pack in a Nissan Leaf can take you anywhere. And recharging could be shaped pretty thoroughly to match supply. So this is pretty nifty. An important use of Flexiwatts is to solve photovoltaics challenge of requiring other resources to ramp up sharply as the strong midday solar generation fades at the end of the day, just as people get home and turn stuff on. That evening fade can be moderated by popular bifacial photovoltaics that work from both sides and can directly face the east and west horizons. But even with those, in these California load profiles, supply must ramp up steeply, as you see at the right, creating what California regulators dub the duck curve, or what Texans call the dead armadillo curve. So how can we manage this evening ramp rate challenge and other kinds of variability in solar and wind power? Well, RMI's hourly simulation for ERCOT, the Texas pool, in summer 2050, systematically combined 8 kinds of demand response with dramatic effect. You see, you start with the gross load in green, and by the time you subtract the net solar generation in the middle of the day, you're left with the magenta net load. Well, to smooth that out, you can engage electric vehicles, home plug loads, residential and commercial domestic hot water, plus heating and cooling controls. And by the time you're through with all 8 of these options, their cumulative effect is to eliminate the dead armadillo curve of the steep evening load ramping. You conveniently cut in half ERCOT's summer daily load range. You save a quarter of the non-renewable capacity. You make renewable energy a third more valuable, and the payback's about 5 months. This hints at how the models that claim renewable growth will devalue itself out of the market are not adequately counting some important remedies that compete with theirs. Now, here's a closer look at that Texas simulation, illustrating a several-fold bigger Flexiwatt resource than had been expected. And it results from looking closer hour by hour. You see the mix keeps shifting. So these 8 kinds of demand response dispatch at different times to level out the net demand reliably and advantageously and inconspicuously. Because, you know, if your air conditioner, water heater, or refrigerator turns off for 15 minutes, you would never know. So such controlled operation has great value to grid operators, and it's yet another potent competitor in power markets. Over decades, utilities around the world have proven many ways to deploy both technical and behavioral demand response. Pricing on-peak use much higher, even 10 to 20 times higher than off-peak use, is especially effective if customers see that price signal and can choose to respond timely, bearing in mind customers who may not be technically sophisticated, who may not have the time, who may not be equipped in many ways to respond. This takes very careful attention to equity issues. But this summary of 14 years of experiments with 4 kinds of time-dependent electricity pricing on 3 continents shows that good programs can cut peak load by over 30% and even over 50%. As you would expect, combining price signals with technological options generally works better than pricing alone, and if done right, can also be very good for equity. Now, so far, we have discussed demand response that's designed to shift the timing of electricity use. But remember, 3/4 of our electricity runs buildings, and making buildings more energy efficient, even by conventional methods, can both reduce and shift their peak electric demand. Efficiency, you see, effectively amplifies the thermal mass of the building. It's thermal time constant. It makes everything happen slower because heat crosses the envelope slower. So the temperature changes in the buildings are much slower as well. There's a 2021 NREL analysis showing order of magnitude investment reductions when you apply this strategy to the US building stock to displace long duration hydrogen storage and the green electricity needed to produce it. This study looks to me quite conservative. For example, it assumes that retrofitted building efficiency's cost will rise parabolically with savings. That's in marked contrast to the literature and case studies in our buildings lectures. But it does make the important point that energy efficiency can be a very powerful ingredient of 100% renewable electricity if we actually compete or compare demand side with supply side resources. And in this case, the authors, Hassani and Livingood, did the novel thing of competing demand side with storage resources. Well, now we're going to find the same thing from a different direction, designing whole portfolios of demand and supply side, including storage resources. Now, we've seen how coal plants are rapidly retiring, gas-fired generation is coming next. So new and old combined cycle gas plants no longer have a business case, even with cheap fracked gas. Their market is collapsing because all of their outputs, energy, capacity, ramping and flexibility, and ancillary services like voltage and frequency stability can be provided faster, better, cheaper by locally customized carbon-free clean energy portfolios that combine demand side and renewable and storage assets in a locally optimized way. This competition could strand over $100 billion of planned US gas plants and $500 billion of gas supply to fuel them. Investors promptly noted RMI's pioneering analysis and scuttled a lot of those investments, as we'll see in a minute. Notice that clean energy portfolios are even more competitive across the range of attributes and use cases than any of their constituent technologies alone. So this portfolio approach renders obsolete the traditional comparisons between single technologies. RMI did an influential update in 2019, finding that clean energy portfolios could beat over 90% of proposed US combined cycle gas plants and could beat the operating costs of existing such plants alone by the early 2030s. Efficiency and demand response sped up that win by a decade. Of course, the portfolio's recipes vary over time and space, and they depend on what kind of gas plant they're displacing. And then in 2021, the analysis was further refined with similar results. On the left, clean energy portfolios levelized cost of energy in light blue, shown here for the Midwest US and before Putin's war spiked gas prices, undercut the total cost of a new combined cycle gas plant in 2018. It's expected to beat just its operating cost around 2031, or sooner if gas's three big externalities discussed earlier, CO2, methane, and historic gas price volatility, actually get priced. But starting in the late 2020s, look on the right, you see the fraction of combined cycle gas plants proposed nationwide in 2021 that risk becoming stranded assets rises to over 90% by the mid-2030s if gas prices increase or if renewable and storage prices keep decreasing. And it rises to over 50%, an even chance of stranding your asset in the mid-2020s with increased renewable and storage costs and low gas prices. So generally, there's too little time to build the gas plants and recover their cost. That's why many are being prudently canceled. In fact, many is an understatement. All source procurement is a promising tool for analyzing portfolios of clean energy resources as an alternative to new gas. When you do all source procurement, utility or other entity will seek bids for all types of resources before determining the optimal set of supply-demand assets to build. In other words, it'll get real-time cost and capability data to inform the investment decisions. Huh? I mean, that's not what they all do? Well, no, it's not. And utilities that run all source procurement processes have largely found portfolios of clean energy be cheaper than building new gas capacity to meet their future needs. Across 7 recent all source procurements surveyed in a 2021 report in which the energy portfolios competed with new gas. Only 93 megawatts of new gas was selected out of about 7,500 megawatts. In other words, just over 1% of all the capacity procured went to gas. And it almost never makes sense to buy gas capacity if you fairly compare with the full range of alternatives. The only surveyed case that chose new gas in Glendale, California, faced significant transmission constraints that limited their ability with current generation clean energy tech to provide reliability services. The gas plants anticipated to run at low capacity factors with a lot less pollution, but of course, demand side options and storage are rapidly relieving those kinds of constraints. As clean energy portfolios win on the supply side, demand faces so-called load defection. That is, customers buying less electricity from the grid because grid power costs more than rooftop PVs with behind the meter batteries, but no net metering. Let me illustrate this with this eye chart that RMI did in 2015 and is coming true. The speed of load defection depends on insolation, solar energy coming in, and on electricity prices, which in these 5 US cities range from Honolulu at the bottom to Louisville, the second down. And just focus on the growth of the colored annual bars. They show potential load defection for households on the left and commercial buildings on the right from 2014 to 2050. So just seeing how those colored bars grow, you can see that there's a potential for load defection to destroy over half of utility revenue in the 2020s just from this competitor. And that's using photovoltaic cost estimates above today's market prices. Now add demand response and customers gain more market power than utilities have. Add electric vehicles with smart bidirectional charging and the grid becomes an optional convenience that you may choose to keep if you really like your utility. So remember also that the battery pack prices of 3 automakers in 2020 were 1/4 what this 2015 analysis assumed for stationary battery packs. And after automotive battery packs lose 1/5 of their original capacity, a lot of them enter a second life. They're reincarnated, if you like, as cheap stationary batteries. So abundant cheap batteries are going to further speed load defection, if not outright grid defection. Where does all this turmoil leave electric utilities? Well, the US telecoms market grew nearly threefold in 23 years after deregulation and restructuring. As the electricity transformation too expands the range and scope and scale of the functions and services desired, which will be best suited to incumbents, the blue part on the left, which can be or should be better provided by others, the bigger tan part on the right, either engaged or integrated by utilities or in an independent and competitive marketplace. Where might hybrid models work best in that boundary area? Most of this giant industry is up for grabs. Utilities are starting to modernize and diversify their revenue models by taking on new roles and risks and functions to serve customers' evolving needs and capabilities. So here's a conceptual graph illustrating revenue transitions under the ambitious so-called REV rules set by New York State utility regulators. REV sensibly encourages and enables utilities to make customers' increasing market power a source of collaborative success rather than competitive distress, and to escape historic traps of rewarding utilities for selling more energy or for spending more money. But I'm not sure that REV fully deals with a deeper level at which the old business model is broken. Here's that story. Thomas Edison solved this problem around 1880. He didn't sell electricity, he sold light, charging a cent to run a lamp for an hour. Because as an investor, he realized that lamps would become far more efficient, and he wanted efficiency to cut his costs and raise his profits. But in 1892, New York Edison Company overruled him and switched to selling kilowatt hours for whatever customers wanted to use them for, lights, motors, or whatever. And except in street lighting, that remains the business model today, selling kilowatt hours, selling electrons, not services. But that means that customer efficiency cuts not the utility's costs, but its revenues. Utilities sell a commodity, but customers want an infrastructure or a service like hot showers and cold beer. Oil and gas companies use the same flawed business model. They sell molecules, not services. So that upside down revenue model will not get fixed until utilities or their partners or their successors shift to selling comfort, torque, lighting, and other services like the French model of chauffage or space heating service, or like Future Energy Solutions, it's a company, lighting as a service for thousands of US and European customers. So what can utilities do as the 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse start to close in with more coming over the hill? Well, ostrich is not a smart strategy. Sticking your head in the sand and your rump in the air lacks only a kick-me sign. It's also not smart to resist by blocking or taxing competitors, as the shareholder-owned utilities trade organization urges and the Koch brothers lobbyists seek. This does tend to backfire by allying Greens with Tea Party libertarians and other conservative anti-monopolists, resulting in what's called the Green Tea movement that has already turned utility politics much greener in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, and North Carolina, with more to come. Arizona Public Service Company tried this approach to deal with solar competition and got just 1/10 of the increased customer charge it sought, plus these kinds of priceless free headlines. Wow. Trying to tax the sun in Arizona and suppress its use annoys customers. Angry customers leave the grid faster. That's good for them, but it's potentially suicidal for utilities. The California PUC's original proposal to impose the nation's highest monthly fee for using solar power is not even in the interest of the utilities that urged it. Neither is the weaker version they later adopted after a firestorm of protest, and I'm afraid that may not end well. Well, another approach, utilities could just hang on, choosing to be not a midwife for new technologies, but a mortician for old ones, and trying to maximize shareholder value while managing decline. This may work for some players for some time, but it's not much fun, and it's ever more vulnerable as finance deteriorates. In Germany, even before PVs made 5% of electricity, they had destroyed the business model and half the market value of Europe's top 10 utilities, which had bet against renewables. That all happened by 2014, when renewables were already Germany's biggest power source and fossil fuel generation hit a 35-year low. Wholesale power prices were cut in half in 4 years. The German government then tried to tilt advantage back toward the utilities, but even today, many are still struggling to stabilize and rebuild their share prices as efficiency shrinks demand and renewables take over. It's already meeting half of Germany's inland power needs. It's heading for 80% of supply in this decade under the greener new government. Notice in the graphs at the right that the share of RWE, the bottom graph, has recovered a lot better than the share price of E.ON in the top graph, and we'll see why that might be in a moment. Now, these legacy assets are going to continue losing value. Here are some 2030 German simulations illustrating the low duration curve net of efficiency and renewables. It just keeps dropping towards lower and lower power. So the big thermal plants will run less, they'll ramp more, they'll earn less, and they'll run out of ability to service their fixed costs. And this is happening all over the world, including China, which uses nearly 30% of the world's electricity, but the run hours of the coal plants, leaving aside pandemic and related disruptions, were trending down about 2.5 percentage points a year before the government announced in October 2021 that those plants are going to be fully exposed to market competition. That's a big deal. In India, lately 80% coal-fired, at least 2/3 of the coal capacity costs more just to run than building new solar and wind power. In the US, that number is now 99%, says Bloomberg, of coal plants that cost more to run than to replace with modern renewables. The main exception of this, by the way, is Japan, which does the opposite of economic dispatch. The incumbent utilities are allowed to protect their assets by arbitrarily curtailing renewables that compete with them. This makes most big renewable projects unfinanceable, chiefly wind power, a rich resource that's been almost completely suppressed. But even this anti-competitive policy is starting to shift as economic and political logics become just too strong to ignore. Well, incumbents can instead embrace change. They can collaborate to finance the transition. They could buy the insurgents and offer their products as their own branded products, or do other kinds of co-opetition. They could become a neutral integrator of all technically qualified offerings. They could do all of the above, and they can fix the upside down business model by selling not the electricity commodity, but the services customers want, the hot showers and cold beer. Germany's biggest and most market-owned utility, E.ON, first tried consolidation, but having two incompatible business models fight it out under one roof didn't work and had to be reversed a year later. So then E.ON boldly split in two, as did the number 2 utility, RWE. The new company at E.ON was to deliver efficiency and renewables and customer-centric services. The unprofitable legacy business of big thermal plants went to the shareholders, who could decide whether they want growth or slowly deteriorating value. And now nearly half that business is being sold. E.ON became a grid, a retail, and a services firm, swapping its renewables to RWE. RWE swapped its grid to E.ON. Only in November 2021 did RWE's new CEO announce a $57 billion plan to double its renewables to 50 gigawatts. But by then it was smaller than Italy's Enel and Spain's Iberdrola, which were both doing well with renewables, while Enel explores non-commodity services. Well, now seeing how this is playing out, you could see a possible reason for RWE's better recovery from its slump, right? They got the renewables. The French utility, GDF Suez, reinvented as Engie, chose to focus on the future and cash out the rest. So they regained health with 80,000 employees worldwide delivering energy services. But they've had some rough times too, and the CEO was removed because she wasn't going fast enough. There's this conflict you often run into that David Crane fell afoul of between the rate of cultural change in the executive suite and in the rest of the company and in the shareholders and in the Wall Street analysts who may not fully understand your business. It's best to lead these shifts, not lag them. So some US utilities are inventing new business models, some with the help of RMI's Electricity Innovation Lab, or eLab. Green Mountain Power already markets, finances, and helps install customers' batteries, appliances, Negawatts, and Flexiwatts in concert with industry partners, although customers may choose others if they wish. Green Mountain Power's ex-CEO, a former RMI trustee named Mary Powell, just took over the top residential photovoltaic firm Sunrun and inked a deal with Ford. Avista is building in Spokane a micro platform for commercial buildings to swap distributed services like PVs and storage and Flexiwatts. Nice thing for a utility to do. 21st Century Utilities is even aiming to buy a mid-sized regulated utility and shift it to highly renewables supply through a million rate base model that buys customer-cited clean energy from approved vendors, all financed on bill. Those kinds of virtual utilities are becoming ever more interesting, and big tech is starting to move in. Over time, traditional utilities monopoly space is likely to shrink, while the opportunity and attractiveness of expanding into the greater frontiers at the distribution edge will grow. Some firms and some regulators will be better than others at remaining agile and adaptive and adventurous while prudent. Rural co-ops like mine, called Holy Cross Energy in Western Colorado, heading rapidly for 100% renewables, are proving among the fastest moving experimenters and reformers, because they don't have investors or regulators, they have members. And in a world where Tesla and Amazon and Walmart have all registered as utilities, and startup platforms are integrating rooftop solar with on-site Negawatts, Flexiwatts, and storage, perhaps escaping state regulation, it's not obvious that traditional utilities are going to adapt quickly enough to retain their historic advantages. Here's a little sign of things to come. The German home energy storage firm Sonnen, now a Shell subsidiary, is building virtual power plants in 11 countries by aggregating solar plus storage projects. And then they dispatch a bunch of them at once as a utility resource. For example, Sonnen's Australian program called Sonnen Flat charges a fixed monthly fee instead of your utility bill, subscription model. Typically, you pay about $13,000 US to provide your home power and EV for the next 20 years with a payback around 5.5 years. Or third-party financing can give you positive cash flow from day one. And in as little as 7 or 8 years, you own the system, which is very durable. So Sonnen is selling green electricity, ancillary services, resilience, certainty, constant price, and peace of mind. Remember that worrying Australian hedgehog graph, remember that graph? Well, now customers can step out of that spiral of higher price and lower demand and leave the utility to try to figure out how to pay for its obsolete power plants and other assets without its accustomed revenues from captive customers who may by then have fled the grid. So that's a lot of the emerging story of the electricity revolution, a very unfinished story. I have no idea how it'll play out, only that it's going to be like nothing we've ever seen. And there are enormous sums and interests at stake. Like my determined little granddaughter, Kessie, in Borneo, seen here when she was about 5 months old. We're going to need all 4 thumbs and every bit of agility and grit to make a smooth landing. So hang on tight and keep your eyes on the durian. Thank you.